In this video, we want to deploy a Django NextJs project to Azure Web App Services. This is basically the flowchart here we have. First of all, we need to deploy our project locally so that we can develop it and then work on it and to make sure everything works fine. Let me explain some of the pieces a little bit and then we can jump into the actual work. So here we have local basically. If I zoom in a little bit, we have first of all the backend part and then the frontend part. With the backend part, first of all, we need to have a Docker file which includes all the information we need to create the Docker image. And also we have the main project, the Django project. And on the other side, we have the frontend, which is based on NextJs framework. Also, we have the Docker file, a separate Docker file for that project specifically so that it can have all the information for the Docker image. Then for the local setup, to make it work, what we need is Docker Compose. So the responsibility of Docker Compose is that it connects both of these two Docker images, basically. So we have one Docker for Django project and one Docker for NextJs, but they're not connected. They don't know each other. In Docker file, we set up the port in a way that everything is on port 8000. And on the other side, for the NextJs, we expose everything to port 3000. And that way, Docker Compose glue them together, then it runs your project. We'll see what I mean by this in a moment, but let's go and check the Azure Web App Services here and how we can deploy our project actually into production on the cloud using Azure Web App Services. So here again we have two different apps. So two different services, you could say two different servers. So here we pull the Docker container from Docker Hub. Here when we are done with our project, we need to basically push our Docker images into Docker Hub. So later on we can use it and pull all the images from Docker Hub. So we don't need the local setup anymore. And also, we don't need it to have all the projects on GitHub. We just need to create Docker images and then push it into Docker Hub. And then from Docker Hub, we can pull the images and then use it in Azure Web App Services. So here we have Docker Container. As I said, Docker Container for the backend is set on port 8000. Also on the other side, we have frontend on port 3000. Okay, two different services, two different apps. The one Docker is on port 8000 and the other is on port 3000. But the problem here is that Web App Services in Azure doesn't allow you to have port 3000 or 8000. You can't access those ports. So what you need to do is that when you set up your Docker container, you specify the port, the actual port that the project is on, and then automatically Azure Web App Service, it exposes everything to port 80, also for the frontend. So then these two separate servers on port 80s, they communicate to each other through internet. So that's the reason why we have to separate web apps or servers. But that's it for the general overview of what we're going to do. Let's jump into the actual project. So first of all, let me show the whole project to you. So here I've already created two projects, one for Django, one for NextJs. So basically the backend is a really simple Django application, and in the frontend, it's also a really simple NextJs application here. I'm not gonna tell you how to create these two projects. It's not related to this topic, but if you want to get these projects, simply you can go to my GitHub. It's github.com/milachiri, and there you can find this project, Django NextJs Docker. I will put the link in the description. Here you can find a project really easily. You just need to clone it. It's a really simple project. It doesn't do anything special. I'll show it to you in a moment. So basically in the backend part, we have one API says hello world. And then we use this API in the front end to fetch it and then show the data. So here in the page.js, this is the API we're using from the backend, Now we have these two projects. What we need to do is quite simple. Here I have the Docker images for both of these two. So here, the Docker file for the backend. So first of all, I'm using Python 3.10, and these two lines are not really important, so let's skip them. Here we set the working directory. It's going to be app. A Docker is like a box, like a black box. It's like really small server. So you can have different directories in different folders and files inside the Docker itself. So inside the Docker itself, we say that we want to have app as the working directory. So everything should be there. Now, the next thing, it's an empty folder. Okay, what we need to do, first of all, we want to copy requirements.txt from the current path, which is here. It's here inside the backend folder. We have Docker file here, and then we say the Docker that we want to copy requirements.txt from the current location inside the directory inside the Docker. And then when the requirements.txt is inside the Docker, we run pip install so we can install all the modules. And then the next thing is copy everything from the current directory, which is backend, API folder, my app folder, and everything else, and copy it inside the working directory inside Docker, meaning app folder. And then what we need to do is run python manage.py collect statics to have the everything related to CSS and the styles. At the end, we use Gunicorn to run the Django server. We could use just Python manage run server, but Gunicorn is more stable and it's more for production purposes. And then it's going to be on port 8000. So this is basically the Docker file for a back. Now let's check the Docker file for the frontend. So here for the frontend, we have this Docker file. Here we use Node version 18. We have working directory of app. It's the same. Then we first copy and paste it inside app folder. We install all the modules with run npm install. Then we copy the rest of the files, everything that is here, app folder, public folder, everything that is inside the current frontend. And then we can set our environment variables. And then at the end, we expose the project to port 3000. So basically the Docker shows the project on its port 3000, and then we run the project. Now at the end, we have two separate Docker files. Now to glue them together, we use Docker Compose here. So with Docker Compose, simply we need to have two different services, one for the backend and one for the frontend. Here we specify the path for the backend and here for the frontend. And also here we specify the actual folder inside the Docker. It's not really important, you can just skip this line here, volumes. The important part is ports actually. So here we say that we have the project on port 8000 inside Docker. Now when we glue them together with Docker Compose, we want to have the backend again in port 8000. We could say we want to have the project in port 8001. It means that the project inside Docker is on port 8000, but when we use Docker Compose to put them together, now actually at the end it's in port 8001, but we want to stick with 8000. But here, as you can see, I use port 3001. It means that the project inside the Docker is exposed to port 3000, but now at the end, when we have two projects together after Docker Compose, I want to have the project on port 3001. It means that when I go to the browser, I just need to say localhost port 3001, not 3000. So here, we don't have it because we haven't run the Docker Compose yet. So let me do this. This is what we need. Docker-compose up-build. It means that first of all, it builds two Docker files and then it runs it together. So let me run this. Depending on your system, it could take 1 minute or even 5 minutes, but it's done. So now if I try to refresh this, you can see that it says hello world. If I take a look at the network more deeply here, if I refresh, you can see that here I have hello API here. It's sending the request to localhost port 8000 API hello. So if I copy this and paste it over here, as you can see, this is the API in the backend. So we can have access directly into the API itself as well. And as you can see, it's on port 8000. Okay, so it works fine locally. Now what we need to do, we need to build the Docker files and then push them into Docker Hub. So let's get back to the terminal, stop everything, clear here. So there are different ways to do that, but one of the best commands to do that is docker build x. So if I type docker build x, so let me talk about this a little bit. So basically build command creates the Docker images. And then with platform, we use Linux AMD 64. And the reason for that is that because I'm using Mac at the moment, if you don't use this platform tag here, it creates the images. But the problem is that when you want to use those images on Linux server, it doesn't work. So you need to specify that I want images for Linux platforms. And then here you add your tag. So this is your username in Docker Hub website. You need to create a user. This is my username. And then this is the name of the project you want to have there. So I want to just name it backend. And then here you assign a tag to that, which is latest. And then we specify the folder where the Docker file is in. So here, if I show the list of files, here we are in the correct directory. We have backend and frontend and also Docker Compose. So this command should work here. Docker build x build -- platform Linux /AMD 64-T mytechworld backend latest, and this is the name of the folder, and then -- push to push the images directly into Docker Hub. Then I press enter. First of all, it's gonna build the images and then creates the images and then push them into Docker Hub. Perfect. Okay, now let's do the same thing for the frontend part. So Docker build x and change this to frontend and frontend here as well, and just push it there. The frontend part takes much longer because it's a bit heavier. Okay, that's it. Now let's take a look at Docker Hub. Here, when I go to Docker Hub, sign in to my dashboard, and as you can see, 1 minute ago and 3 minutes ago, I have 2 images here. Okay, now it's time to go to the second part, which is actually deploying the project into Azure Web Services. And as I said, we have 2 different services here, 2 different apps. We're going to do them separately. So here you just need to create a resource. We're using web app service. I'm gonna go with the default settings here. And for the app name, I'm gonna say backend fresh. So we're using container Linux. That's right. Let's wait for the region to select from. I'm gonna choose Europe, North Europe, and then the next part we want to take care of is container. We don't have any database at this point, so just container. And enhance this, I'm gonna use other container registries. Main is enough for that. Public, and for the register server URL, we want to use Docker Hub. So the actual correct name for Docker Hub is just docker.io. And then here what I need to do, type my username, because this image is public, so you can use my username, that's fine. mytechworld, and here I can say backend and tag latest. And the port should be the port we specify in the Docker file, which is 8000. It's gonna look for the actual port that the project is exposed on, and then it can reflect it into the final port, which is port 80. And then let's review and create it. So it's done. Let's go to resources And then here, if I click on browse, let's see if it's up and running. Okay. Now the problem here is that we need to put this URL in allowed host in Django. This is something really common. You always need to add your domain name into the allowed hosts. But here, instead of going into the settings and change everything and build everything again and then push it again, what I did, if we take a look at the project in the settings file here, in the allowed hosts, what I did, I added an environment variable called backend URL. So then you can add this environment variable into your web app services. So what I need to do, just copy this variable and then come into environment variables in the dashboard, add a new variable, and then just copy and paste this URL here. So apply. So let's try again. It could take a couple of minutes to be reflected in the actual website, so let's wait a little bit. Let's restart the server. Let's add this domain name to the environment variable instead of, because I believe it has some extra prefix. So here, okay, if I just put this one here, it shouldn't be different, but well, let's just try. Probably you need to wait like 5 minutes or 10 minutes to make it to happen. You just want to do it fast. Interesting. Now everything looks good. So let's try one thing here. We need to try API hello. And well, it works fine. Amazing. Now let's get to the second part, which is the front-end part. So as you can see, we have the project on port 80 for the backend. We're going to have the same thing for the front-end. So get back to home, create a new service, web app service. I'm going to name it Frontend Fresh using container, Linux, and region going to be North Europe. Go to container section, enhance configuration with sidecar support using other registries. I'll leave it as main, and here I'm gonna use docker.io instead. I have no idea why index.docker.io doesn't work, but well, this one works, docker.io. My tech world frontend latest. Okay, and now the project is actually, if you take a look at the Docker file, it's port 3000. One thing that here you need to pay attention is that we don't use the Docker Compose file here at all. There are other situations that we can use that Docker Compose. So if we want to run one server and have both two projects, there we can use Docker Compose. And then we need to add another layer of Nginx to basically do the routing. But here, because we have two different servers, we don't need Docker Compose. We separately pull the Dockers and run them on different servers. And that's it. And create. Okay, now it's ready. Go to resource. Let's browse to see what happens. It shows the project, but the problem is that there's no connection with the backend. If you take a look at the network section here, if I refresh and take a look at Hello API here, the request is failed because, as you can see, it's requesting the same server. Basically, it's requesting the frontend, which is not correct. So the problem is that if I take a look at the project and the frontend and in the page.js here, it's fetching this API, but the backend URL is from config.api URL, which is another API from the NextJs project itself. So if I go to API config, and here, as you can see, the backend URL comes from the environment variable inside NextJs project. So again, what we did with backend, now here we also need to add this environment variable to the project. So we come to environment variables here, add a new link, and then here I need to use the same backend URL. Just put it here. Apply, apply, confirm. So here again, you need to wait a couple of minutes for it to happen. It might not be a bad idea if I just restart the server again. So after a couple of minutes, if I try to refresh again, let's see what's happening. Refresh again. So as you can see, now here we have the correct domain name, which is backend URL and then API hello. There's one tiny problem here that we have double forward slashes. So let's get rid of this extra slash. And one other thing you need to pay attention is that when we are requesting from frontend to a Django project, usually by default you get this cross-origin error. So to fix that problem, we usually install a module for that cross-origin problem. It's called Django course headers. So it's already installed in your project. The only thing you need to do, you need to add frontend URL to your cross or course allowed origins here. So again, as you can see here, I used an environment variable. So the only thing we need to do for this project, you just need to add this frontend URL to your backend server. But before that, let's check this. Check the frontend one more time to see what it shows. So hello. Now the URL looks good, but there is another problem. As you can see here, it's course or cross-origin problem or error. So the final piece is just adding another. We need to go to actually the backend project. So backend fresh environment and add this URL, frontend URL, and then let's just copy the frontend URL from here and then put it here. Apply. Let's just, to make sure, refresh the application and wait a couple of minutes. Now after a couple of minutes, let's try one more time to see what happens. And as you can see, we get hello world. It means that frontend and backend are communicating correctly together, and it's amazing. So now we have projects are live on Azure Web App Services. So here, just to have a quick review, we created our projects and also the Docker file for each backend and frontend side, and then we glue them together using Docker Compose to have them both locally. But in the cloud, actually for this project, we don't need the Docker Compose itself because we're using two different servers to communicate to each other. There are other circumstances that you need Docker Compose, and you can use Docker Compose to have both projects on single server, but in those cases you need to have also Nginx configured to do the routing. But here we just use two app services, one for each backend and frontend. They do the communication through internet. And that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. See you soon. Bye bye.